Welcome to Speaking Opera. My name is Howard Hart. We will be discussing live opera recordings and their history. Our special guest is Bill DePeter, who worked in this field for over 15 years. Bill, can you tell us something about the history and background of this field?
Sure, Howard. Thanks for the introduction. I always enjoy talking about this topic, which was so significant in my life, both personally and professionally. I was in, part of my career. And I think in terms of the history of live opera performances, a lot of it seems to be, in my opinion, associated with developments in technology. The first significant one, as I see it, is the development of the LP recording, because prior to that, it was only possible to record on 78s about 4 minutes per side. To record a complete opera would require 10, 15, 20 discs. So while there were recordings made prior to the LP, there weren't too many of them, and it was a difficult thing for most people to be able to afford to buy a complete opera recording. So consequently, there wasn't a big market for it. With the advent of the LP, then it was possible to release a complete opera on 2 or 3 discs, and made it possible for a lot more people to afford to buy them. And soon after the development of the LP, we had the advent of transferring older recordings to the LP format. And as it turns out, there were a lot of recordings of live performances that had been made going back to the 1930s. And there was a significant interest in a lot of those recordings. It was a question of, you could assemble a nice library of the central works in the repertoire with the singers that the studios wanted to use, but there was a whole generation of singers who had never had an opportunity to record a complete opera, and there was a lot of interest in hearing singers from the previous generation who didn't have that opportunity. I think of singers like Kirsten Flagstad and Lauritz Melchior and Giovanni Martinelli, who didn't have this opportunity, and there was enough of an interest in those singers that there was a market for these live performance recordings. And now with LPs, it was possible to transfer them, and so people were interested in buying them. So that, to me, was the first major development. And of course, we had a very narrow field, I guess you might say, that finding people who had access to these early recordings and the ability to transfer them. And of course, for us, we amateur historians who can look back, we know who the granddaddy of our field was, and that was Eddie Smith. And he began as early as 1956 to make these available to collectors. It was more or less a niche market, and he didn't sell them in retail stores, but he had a mail order, and if you knew where to look, you could find his recordings, and that was the start, as far as I can see, of how these came about. And Eddie started with some transfers of commercial 78 RPM recordings, and very soon moved on to doing these live broadcast recordings that had been taken down by amateurs, or in some cases singers themselves had these services record their own performances so that they would have them for reference. And Eddie was fortunate enough to have contacts with a number of these singers, and that enabled him to obtain these very historic performances, and gave him the opportunity to make them available in LP for the diehard collector who wanted to hear something beyond what the studio recordings were offering.
Can I ask you who some of the singers were?
Well, we already mentioned Kirsten Flagstad, Lauritz Melchior, Giovanni Martinelli, Elizabeth Rethberg, Lawrence Tibbett. These were leading singers. And of course, the sources for these had to be from broadcasts. It wasn't possible to record in the house. So the main source for many of these was the Metropolitan Opera, which had begun broadcasting in 1931. And as early as 1934, complete performances were being taken down. So here we have performances that were 20 or more years old, and it was possible to go back and hear them again. This to collectors was a major boon, and if you might want to hear the singers that you went to the opera house to hear, and they would be making contemporaneous recordings, but what about this previous generation, some of whom never did make a complete opera recording? And in addition to that, there would be singers who had, straddled at both time periods, like Björling and Milanov, who did go on to make complete recordings, but maybe they didn't record all their roles. And you might want to hear Zinka Milanov sing Ernani, which she didn't record, or Jussi Björling sing Romeo and Juliet. So that was another opportunity to hear these great singers in roles that they didn't set down in commercial LPs.
So Eddie was the pioneer. So what came after that?
Well, there came soon after, I wouldn't say soon, but within the next 10 years, I think other people sort of caught on to the idea of a market for live performance recordings, and we came to perhaps the 60s, and by then it was possible to go into an opera house with a tape recorder and take down a live performance. You didn't need to have a broadcast, and we had other new venture people coming in, and other labels like MRF and BJR came along, and they had their own interests and the things that they thought were worthwhile. And so there was more of a proliferation. Again, it wasn't something that you would go into just any store and find. It was very much a specialty and be under the counter, or by mail order only kind of thing. But it became a real niche market, and I think there was an interest in singers, there was an interest in repertoire, and there was a better quality as time went on. People became more sophisticated, and the market became more demanding. If you were going to release a new recording of an opera that had never been performed in 100 years, you might want a libretto with that, or more information about the performance, whether the singers or the recording. So I think as time went on, that became another development, that people expected more than simply a disc and a paper sleeve, and we got more as time went on. And this was also in tandem, I think, with the musical trends that were current at the time. So the revival of the bel canto operas of Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini, the early Verdi recordings, some Strauss operas that hadn't been recorded by the studios. I think there was certainly interest in many of these different aspects of music and performance.
You mentioned MRF and BJR, and we'll discuss other labels later on. When you mention interest, are you speaking of the operas or of the singers, or both?
Oh, I think it's definitely both. I mean, the ideal would be to have a great or interesting singer singing in an unusual opera, but you might have a well-known singer doing a role that they hadn't recorded, some particular soprano singing Aida. Maybe she didn't record it, but you'd like to hear it. Or you might have some unusual Donizetti opera that hadn't been performed in 100 years, and better if it's a famous singer, but if they had unknown singers, it was okay anyway, because you wanted to hear the music.
So Bill, when did you come along, and what was the state of the industry at that time?
Well, I started in that industry in 1980, and at that time what had occurred was the European countries had made it legal to release any live performance that was more than 50 years old. It became public domain. One of the things that had always held back the manufacturers in the United States was that it wasn't clear whether they needed permission to release these performances. But I think the change in the European laws gave a sense of legitimacy to the distribution of these recordings. And I think at that point, a lot more of the retail stores felt that it was okay for them to have these recordings on their shelves. And in turn, the American manufacturers or producers were also a little more able to, sell their product in retail stores. And when I came along, we were already able to, distribute and sell to, the leading retail record chains like Tower and King Carol and, the well-known stores in the major cities. So for me, it was an opportunity not only to participate in this and gain a lot of satisfaction out of helping to get out some of these wonderful things that I had always wanted to hear and see on records. And that was where we were kind of when I came along.
And when you say I came along, were you working? What were you doing? What kind of work did you do in the field?
What I did was to coordinate the production of each recording. So I would gather all the information, prepare the graphics for the record label, for the cover, make sure that everything was coordinated and ready at the right time, and then get them into our warehouse and ready to be shipped. So I also did a lot of research to make sure that we had as much information as it was possible to get in terms of casting and dates and titles, and that was my main interest.
Who would make the decisions, or how would you make decisions as to what performances you would make available to the public?
There were a number of different reasons. There was, of course, a lot of interest in any performance that was a first performance of an opera in recent memory, or a first role performance by a major singer. So if one of the three tenors was going to sing their first Enzo and Gioconda, of course everyone would want to hear that, and that might be a reason to do so. And we had people who made suggestions, people who dug around in the archives and found something that hadn't been around before in any form, and that would be something of interest. We have something like the Aida with Callas from Covent Garden, which had only been circulating with one act, but when the entire performance came along, that was something of interest to collectors.
When that was first released, I was around at that time, and I remember that two of the Callas performances, which made me very happy because I'm, as you well know, a very big fan of Maria Callas. I believe that was the first time it was put out complete on CD.
Right.
If I'm not, and we're both mentioned on that. And then later on, the label is, at that time, he used it. There were a number of different names for the label of the company you worked for, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. That was Legato Classics.
Legato. Yeah. And then later, you issued the Maria Callas in Dallas, mm-hmm. which I believe was the first time that had been released on CD.
Right, and of course the famous Lisbon Traviata with Callas and Alfredo Kraus was another great discovery that caught a lot of interest from a lot of people.
So I have another question, since we're kind of going a little bit here and a little bit there. A number of singers you worked directly with some of the singers for tapes and performances. Did they ask you to put out these performances in some cases? And maybe we should mention the names if you're okay. Some of them are now not with us any longer, but we'll have to trust your honesty.
Well, you had a whole spectrum of reactions from the singers. Many of them were very enthusiastic, and some of them did, of course, want to have performances of roles that they knew they were never going to record available to their fans. We had Mirella Freni, Placido Domingo, Richard Tucker. I mean, there were definitely interest in perpetuating or preserving their legacy and making that available to their fans.
Were there some operas that weren't recorded commercially that were available through your company in Legato and Lyric? right? At that time.
Yeah, or HRE.
And HRE and ERR, were there performances that the singers had never recorded that were wanted by the public in general?
Oh, certainly, yeah. And, for instance, a rare Meyerbeer opera, L'Africaine, which was performed with Shirley Verrett and Placido Domingo. And at that point, there wasn't much interest in Meyerbeer by the commercial labels, and to have this opera, which to this day hasn't been commercially recorded, available with these major singers, was something that the real hardcore opera fans were definitely interested in.
I remember years ago, before we met, and I worked in Harvard Square at Discount Records, and we were laughing at this originally. Eventually, I made some friends with people who used to go to that store to buy recordings, and they would always look at. Do you remember the bin from Maria Callas?
Oh,
what it
yes,
said? What did it say?
It said Maria Callas' Voice of Truth. I was there. I saw it.
And that's before we became friends.
Right.
And an interesting part of working in that store, and this was that Harvard University was literally right across the street, and they would order MRF, and we would get orders in, and they had, MRF in particular had done many Meyerbeer and Cherubini operas, and they did a lot of unusual repertory, and also they furnished librettos, which I think was probably a key in a way, but they ordered almost the whole catalog at one point.
And I'm going to amend my earlier statement because it came back to me that the bin was actually Voice of Truth and Beauty.
Thank you. I wasn't going to correct you. It was a long time ago. So it's a wonderful experience, and we'll talk later on together about our experiences in the music field.
Right.
I will put something in here now, which it sort of makes me look at years now have passed, and how many wonderful singers I've met. I won't mention their names here, or maybe I will. I have to think about it. Who asked me for recordings of live performances that they were on,
right,
that commercial recordings had never issued. And I think there was absolutely an interest, without a doubt.
Right.
I've seen a lot of comments on Facebook about how the wonderful experiences people have had with live performances and how important they were, and how singers talk about them.
Yes, definitely.
You remember we were at a tribute 2 years ago. Neil Shikoff talked a great deal about the live performances and how wonderful they were, and how he looked forward to them. And
yeah, no, Neil was someone that my boss was friendly with, and
who's that?
That was Ed Rosen, and you would get interest from them not only in their own performances. I mean, they might be performing in some venue in Europe or in another part of the world, and they didn't necessarily have access to their recordings, but we wouldn't necessarily, of course, release them, but we might get a tape that the singer would be interested in getting, so that they could study their own performance perhaps, and use that to improve their interpretation perhaps, and just to hear how they're doing. And I remember Jose Carreras was also a friend of Ed's, and Cacio Ricciarelli, and they were just starting out their international careers, and Ed was friendly with them, and before they were able to make a lot of commercial recordings, Ed was releasing their live things so that people could get to know them. And Carreras was especially enthusiastic about that, because even though there were recordings down the road for him, some of the live performances were his calling card for when he would appear for the first time, say in San Francisco or Chicago, that these live recordings had preceded him.
Later on in our conversations and whatever interviews that we're doing together, we can talk more about our experiences individually with people that we became friends with, which is really for a segment unto itself.
Yes.
But I do want to share one Eddie Smith story.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 16 years old, which was a long time ago, I'm now 74, I went to a record store called Book Clearing House in Boston, I still remember going in. I was 16, and I had saved my lunch money to buy a record, and I bought a highlights of Trovatore with Maria Callas, uh, Kurt Baum, Simeonato, and Warren. Am I
Yes,
right?
right.
And Pico, was it?
Yes,
Pico,
he
yeah.
was the conductor.
It's a long time ago. Anyway, I bought the record and I took it home. And the fellow who was in the store knew that I loved Callas. He said, "You should start listening to the live performances." And I took it home and I put it on. I went, "Oh, this is awful. I can't listen to this." And it was, I didn't know the Mexico City performances yet. Now I have them all and I can, it's no problem. But I took it home and I thought, "Oh, I can't keep this. This is not for me." So I took it back, and the fellow, I will be grateful to him. I still remember him, and we became friends later on. And he said, "Take it home again and listen to it again and think about it." He said, "This is a different time. It's a rarity. You're not going to find this." There were no other stores in Boston that were carrying live performances that I knew of at that time. Uh, and so I took it home again. Then I listened to it over and over and over and over again, like I still do with recordings. And I fell in love with it. And even though, like many of the Mexico, or maybe all of them, of the Mexico City performances, and it was amazing. It was amazing. And I was already hooked on Maria, but I was so glad to have that. And it opened up another door for me in my love of opera, which is to listen to live performances.
Yeah, my first experience with a live opera recording was The Siege of Corinth. This was in 1974 or 5. There was a lot of publicity about Beverly Sills making her Met debut in this opera. And there was a record store, I still remember it, on West 4th Street, Discophile. Go down the stairs and go in the back, and they had any number of these live performance recordings, and there was The Siege of Corinth from La Scala with Beverly Sills and Marilyn Horne. And I snatched that up and took it home, and I knew that opera backward and forward before Beverly Sills stepped on the Met stage. So that was my introduction. And also, as you mentioned, it opened a whole world to me of live performance recordings.
Very interesting. We'll visit this later. I will mention one other story. We're going to be storytelling, I can see, but this is good. It will make it hopefully more interesting and people will connect to something. It's about a man that I became very close friends with later on. I lived my first apartment in New York. When I moved to New York, I was 30, was on 89th and Riverside, and on 99th and Broadway was a man who I didn't know at that time that I would later on become good friends with, and we'll talk about him more later. But I was working, at this time it was in the late 60s. I was my first record store job. I worked at Craze Music on Bromfield Street. I still remember it. I was there about 2 weeks and I became the manager of the store. I was a kid. I don't know, maybe 20 or even less. And a friend of mine who worked at that time at Boston Music Company, which is now long since gone, but they carried recordings. He called me on the phone and he said, "There's a guy here with a bag of records, and I think you should meet with him because I know you love Maria Callas." He said, "He's really something else. He's very interesting." He said, and this was like a meetup. I was like, it was bizarre. I loved it. He said, "He'll meet you on the corner on the Boston Commons on the corner of Boylston and Tremont." And I went, "Oh, okay." He said, "He has a bag of records. He's really nice, and and bring some cash because if you want to buy something." And so I met Santiago Rodriguez. That was my first meet with him. Later on, I became a very good friend. I went to his house many times for dinner, and he would play tapes and we'd talk. And I met Bill Carroll, who we'll talk about later, who I knew very, very well, so to speak. And this fellow introduced himself, Santiago Rodriguez. He said, "I have some Maria Callas recordings. All I needed to do was hear this. I had never had it." He said, "I have the 1951 Aida with the high E flat at the end of the triumphal scene with Delmonico, Aurelio Dominguez," and I was so excited. And he said, "This is fabulous." And the way that Rod was, you knew him also. He was very enthusiastic. I adored him. And so I bought the Aida and I went home, and it's good that Needles didn't eat records up because I played that E flat many, many, many times. Wow. But it was the beginning of a wonderful experience, another door opening. And I was then in my early 20s. Yeah. And I loved operas on live opera performances because they opened another experience. I still collected studio recordings and loved them at that point too.
Right. And my introduction to the opera, the personalities in live opera was Ed Rosen, who used to go to the Metropolitan Opera. This is very early when he was just starting with LPs. And he would stand in the family circle with his little bag of records. And if you knew who he was, you could go over and he would have his latest releases. And I remember the first one I bought from him was Renato Scotto and Jose Carreras singing duets.
Right. I remember that all very, very well.
Yeah, and that's how I got to know Ed. And ultimately I ended up working for him.
This concludes the first episode of Live Opera on Disc, A Short History. I want to thank Bill DePeter for joining us today. We will continue on with transfers on pre-LP material, proliferation of various live labels, introduction to public domain in Europe, a spread of the live labels in retail stores, transition to CDs, the demise of brick and mortar stores, transition to downloads and file shares, and the current status today of live operas on disc or on file shares. I really would like to encourage you to go to our website directly. SpeakingOpera.com is our website. Speaking Opera on Facebook is a Facebook page. Speaking Opera on YouTube. Also, there will be an Instagram page as well. I want to thank you for joining me today. I want to thank Bill DePeter also for being willing to do this 3-part presentation of live opera on disc.